It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop on a quiet Tuesday night. A flashing siren, a demanded license, a quick citation. But when a bitter, small-town police officer decided to harass a lone black woman on a deserted highway, he made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't know she was a decorated Navy SEAL, and he definitely didn't know that in less than 12 hours she would be sworn in as his new commanding officer. The rain was coming down in sheets, drumming a relentless, rhythmic beat against the roof of the 1978 Ford Bronco. Lieutenant Commander Stella Jenkins kept her eyes fixed on the winding, slick asphalt of Route 9. She was exhausted, the kind of deep, bone-weary fatigue that only came after months of back-to-back deployments and the mental strain of a massive career transition. For the past 12 years, Stella had existed in the shadows. As one of the military's most elite operators, a trailblazer who had shattered every physical and mental ceiling to earn her trident, she had operated in environments most people couldn't even point to on a map. She had survived firefights in the Korengal Valley, conducted high-altitude jumps into pitch-black hostile territories, and led men who trusted her with their lives. But tonight, she was just a civilian driving into the sleepy, coastal town of Oak Haven, Washington. Oak Haven was a picturesque town on the surface, but underneath it was rotting. The Department of Justice had recently flagged the Oak Haven Police Department for a pattern of civil rights violations, corruption, and systemic racism. The federal government, in cooperation with the state's governor, had forced a massive restructuring. They needed an outsider to clean house. They needed someone unbreakable. They called Stella. Tomorrow morning, she was scheduled to be officially sworn in as the new captain of the Oak Haven Police Department, leading a specialized joint task force. Tonight, however, she was just a woman in a faded gray hoodie, driving below the speed limit in a rainstorm. Suddenly, the familiar glare of red and blue lights pierced the darkness in her rearview mirror. Stella glanced at her speedometer. She was doing 42 in a 50-mile-per-hour zone. Her tail lights were perfectly functional, her tags were up to date, and she had maintained her lane perfectly despite the torrential downpour. A knot of realization tightened in her stomach. She knew exactly what this was. She engaged her blinker, pulling the heavy Bronco onto the muddy shoulder of the highway. She shifted the vehicle into park, turned off the engine, and rolled down her window, letting the cold, biting wind whip into the cabin. She placed both of her hands on the steering wheel, right at 10 and 2, visible and still. In the side mirror, she watched the driver's side door of the police cruiser swing open. A large, heavy-set officer stepped out. He didn't rush. He took his time, adjusting his duty belt with an exaggerated swagger, his flashlight cutting through the rain as he approached her vehicle. Officer Mateo Briggs had been on the Oak Haven force for 15 years. He was a man who enjoyed the power of the badge far more than the responsibility it entailed. He was notorious in the county for his proactive policing, a sanitized term for profiling and harassing anyone who didn't fit his narrow, bigoted view of what an Oak Haven resident should look like. Briggs stopped just behind her door, shining his high-lumen maglite directly into Stella's eyes, blinding her temporarily. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Briggs barked, his voice dripping with an unearned authority. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't state the reason for the stop. "Good evening, officer," Stella said, her voice calm, modulated, and entirely devoid of fear. It was the same voice she used when coordinating airstrikes under heavy enemy fire. "My license is in my wallet, which is in my back right pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed?" Briggs scoffed, clearly irritated by her composure. People usually stammered. They usually shook. Her calm demeanor felt like a challenge to him. "Just get the documents, and no sudden movements, you hear me?" Stella slowly reached back, retrieved her wallet, and pulled out her standard civilian driver's license. She then reached over to the glove box, retrieved the registration, and handed the stack of papers out the window. Briggs snatched them from her hand, shining his light on the ID. "Stella Jenkins, out-of-state license." He leaned in closer, the smell of stale coffee and cheap chewing tobacco wafting into the car. "You're a long way from the city, Stella. What brings you to a nice, quiet town like Oakhaven at 2 a.m? "I'm relocating for a new job," Stella replied evenly. "Is that right?" Briggs sneered, his flashlight sweeping the interior of her Bronco, lingering on a few duffel bags in the back seat. "What kind of job? You people don't usually move out this way unless you're running from something." "You people." The words hung in the cold air. Stella's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but her training kept her heart rate completely steady. "I can assure you, officer, I am not running from anything. Now, could you please tell me why I was pulled over?" Briggs ignored the question. "Step out of the vehicle." "I am asking you, as is my legal right, to articulate the reasonable suspicion for this traffic stop," Stella said, her tone hardening just a fraction. Briggs's face flushed red, his ego immediately bruised. He rested his hand on the butt of his service weapon. "I said, step out of the damn vehicle. You were swerving, reckless driving. Now get out before I pull you out." Stella knew he was lying. She also knew that escalating a situation with an armed, unstable and clearly racist police officer on an empty, dark highway was tactically unsound. She could have disarmed him in exactly 3 seconds. She mentally mapped out the sequence: trap the wrist, strike the radial nerve, pivot, sweep, and secure the weapon. But she wasn't here to be a vigilante. She was here to expose the rot. And Briggs was handing her a shovel. "I am complying," Stella said firmly. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, opened the heavy door, and stepped out into the freezing rain. "Hands on the hood! Legs spread!" Briggs yelled, his voice echoing over the sound of the storm. Stella turned, placed her hands flat on the wet hood of her Bronco, and spread her feet. Briggs kicked her right ankle hard, forcing her stance wider than necessary. He patted her down roughly, his hands lingering just a little too long, crossing the line from a standard Terry frisk into deliberate harassment. "Nothing on you," Briggs muttered, sounding almost disappointed. "I'm going to search your vehicle." "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," Stella stated clearly, turning her head slightly to look at him. "You have no probable cause." "I smell marijuana," Briggs lied through his teeth, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "That gives me all the probable cause I need." The interior of the Oakhaven Police Department was a stark contrast to the freezing storm outside. It was suffocatingly warm, smelling of pine cleaner, old paper, and stale sweat. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry hornets. Stella was marched through the double doors, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. Briggs had ratcheted the steel cuffs down to the bone, a petty punishment for her absolute refusal to show fear. Her wrists throbbed, but compared to the pain of survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, school, it barely registered on her radar. "Keep moving," Briggs shoved her shoulder, propelling her toward the booking desk. Behind the high wooden counter sat Sergeant Miller, an older, heavy-set man with a receding hairline who looked like he was counting the days until his pension kicked in. He looked up from his crossword puzzle, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the scene. "Tommy," Miller said, his voice hesitant. "What do we have here?" "Caught this one out on Route 9, Briggs said loudly, making sure the 2 other officers in the bullpen could hear him. "Reckless driving, resisting arrest, and suspicion of narcotics possession." Miller frowned, looking at Stella. Despite the wet hair plastered to her forehead and the cuffs digging into her wrists, she stood with perfect, rigid posture. She wasn't looking at the floor. Her piercing brown eyes were scanning the room, absorbing every detail. She was logging the layout, noting the position of the officers, the unsecured keycards on the desks, and the blind spots in the security cameras. "Did you find any narcotics in the car, Briggs?" Miller asked, sounding tired. "No," Briggs spat, looking annoyed. "She probably tossed it out the window before I got to her. But she gave me a load of lip. Thought she was a legal scholar. Kept talking about her rights." He used air quotes, mockingly. "Officer Briggs searched my vehicle illegally, destroyed my personal property during the search, and fabricated a reason for the initial stop," Stella said. Her voice cut through the ambient noise of the precinct like a scalpel. "I want to speak to the shift commander." Briggs let out a harsh laugh. "You think you're in a position to make demands? You're a suspect. You sit there and shut up." "Actually," Stella continued, turning her gaze directly to Sergeant Miller, ignoring Briggs entirely. "According to your own departmental operating procedure, specifically Section 4, Paragraph B, any suspect alleging civil rights violations during an arrest must be allowed to speak with a superior officer holding the rank of lieutenant or higher." The room went dead silent. The two officers in the bullpen stopped typing. Sergeant Miller stared at her, his pen slipping from his fingers. The fact that this civilian knew the exact bureaucratic coding of their internal rulebook was deeply unsettling. Briggs, however, was too blinded by his own arrogance to see the trap. He grabbed Stella by the bicep, his grip bruising. "I'm the only commander you need to worry about right now. Empty your pockets." Miller sighed, standing up. "Look, Tommy, maybe we should just write her a citation and let her go. The new captain comes in tomorrow. We don't need any messy paperwork on the desk first thing in the morning." "I am not letting go, Greg," Briggs snapped. "She's spending the night in a cell. Maybe a few hours on concrete will teach her some respect for law enforcement." They processed her. They took her shoelaces, her belt, her wallet, and her phone. Stella watched carefully as Briggs threw her belongings into a plastic bin. "You get one phone call," Miller offered, his eyes holding a brief flicker of apology. "I don't need to make a call," Stella replied smoothly. "I'll wait." She knew that if she made a call, she could have the governor, the mayor, and a team of federal lawyers kicking down the precinct doors in 20 minutes. But that would just result in Briggs getting a slap on the wrist, a paid suspension, and eventually his job back. She didn't want him suspended. She wanted to surgically dismantle the corrupt culture of this precinct from the inside out. To do that, she needed them to hang themselves. Briggs grabbed her arm again and led her down a long, narrow hallway lined with holding cells. The air here was colder, smelling of ammonia and despair. He unlocked cell 3, a barren concrete box with a single metal bench bolted to the wall. "In!" he ordered. Stella stepped inside. She turned to face him as he slammed the heavy iron door shut. The lock engaged with a loud, metallic clank. "You know," Briggs sneered through the bars, "people like you come into our town thinking you own the place. But in here, you're nothing. You're just another criminal." Stella looked at him. She didn't glare. She didn't yell. She just looked at him with an expression of profound, clinical pity. "Officer Briggs," Stella said softly, "you have absolutely no idea what you've just done." "I know exactly what I've done. You're under arrest," he laughed, turning on his heel and walking back down the corridor. "Enjoy the accommodations." Left alone in the dim light, Stella sat down on the cold metal bench. She crossed her legs, closed her eyes, and began controlled breathing exercises. 4 seconds in. Hold for 4. 4 seconds out. Hold for 4. Box breathing. the same technique she used while submerged in freezing water during tactical training. The night dragged on. The storm outside raged, rattling the small barred window near the ceiling of the cell. Stella didn't sleep. She used the time to mentally draft the termination paperwork for Officer Mateo Briggs, as well as an exhaustive tactical plan for restructuring the entire patrol division. She wasn't a victim trapped in a cage. She was a predator sitting in a blind, waiting for the sun to rise. Morning broke over Oak Haven, painting the sky in pale shades of grey and blue. The storm had passed, leaving the town washed clean, though the mud still clung to the tires of the police cruisers parked outside the 42nd Precinct. At 7:45 a.m., the precinct was buzzing with the chaotic energy of a shift change. Officers from the night shift were yawning over terrible coffee, while the day shift officers were securing their vests and complaining about the cold. Officer Briggs was leaning against the break room counter, regaling a few of his colleagues with the story of his heroic midnight bust. "I'm telling you, she was wired," Briggs lied, taking a sip from his mug, probably moving weight across county lines. "I locked her up in cell 3. She thought she was tough, quoting policy at me. I put an end to that real quick." "You sure you didn't overstep, Tommy?" asked Officer Higgins, a younger cop who always seemed uncomfortable with Briggs's methods. "The mayor has been breathing down our necks all month, and the new captain is supposed to be here any minute." "Relax, Greg," Briggs scoffed. "The new captain is some desk jockey the state is sending down to push papers. Probably some politician's buddy. They don't know real police work. I handle the streets. They can handle the spreadsheets." At exactly 8 a.m., the heavy glass double doors of the precinct swung open. The low hum of conversation in the bullpen instantly died. Mayor David Henderson, a tall, austere man in a sharp navy suit, strode into the room. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were 2 large men in dark suits, holding briefcases, Department of Justice monitors, and City Councilwoman Davis. The officers in the room quickly straightened up, setting down their coffee mugs. Sergeant Miller practically jumped out of his chair behind the booking desk. "Mr. Mayor," Miller stammered, smoothing down his uniform shirt. "We weren't expecting you so early. Can I help you?" Mayor Henderson looked around the messy bullpen, his expression one of deep distaste. "Sergeant Miller, I am here for a scheduled 8 a.m. briefing with the new captain of the Joint Task Force. She was supposed to meet me outside the building 5 minutes ago. Have you seen her?" Miller blinked. "The new captain, sir?" "No, nobody new has come through those doors this morning. We assumed she was running late." Henderson frowned, pulling out his cell phone and checking the screen. "That is highly uncharacteristic of her. Captain Jenkins is a woman built on precision. She is never late." Across the room, Officer Briggs froze. The coffee in his cup suddenly felt like acid in his stomach. "Jenkins?" "Excuse me, Mr. Mayor," Briggs said, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped forward. "Did you say Captain Jenkins?" "Yes, officer," Henderson said, his tone clipped. "Captain Stella Jenkins. She's being brought in to take full command of this precinct, effective immediately. Has anyone tried calling her?" We don't have her contact information, sir," Miller said nervously. One of the DOJ agents stepped forward, his face completely devoid of emotion. "Captain Jenkins's vehicle GPS tracker shows that her car has been parked in your impound lot since 2:15 a.m. The color rapidly drained from Sergeant Miller's face. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Briggs. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. "Officer Briggs," Miller said, his voice trembling. "What was the name of the woman you brought in last night?" Briggs felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. His mouth was completely dry. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. It was... Mayor Henderson's eyes narrowed. He looked from the terrified sergeant to the pale officer. What is going on here? Where is Captain Jenkins? Before Briggs could formulate a lie, a calm, steady voice echoed down the concrete hallway leading from the holding cells. I'm right here, Mr. Mayor. Every head in the room snapped toward the hallway. Sergeant Miller scrambled for the cell keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the heavy iron door of cell 3. Stella Jenkins stepped out into the hallway and walked slowly toward the bullpen. She was still wearing the faded grey hoodie, now wrinkled from a night on concrete. Her hands were free, but the angry red welts from Briggs's over-tightened handcuffs were starkly visible on her wrists. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a general walking onto a battlefield she had already won. "Stella!" Mayor Henderson gasped, rushing forward. He looked at her bruised wrists, then at the dirty clothes, his face flushing with absolute fury. "What in God's name happened to you? Why are you in a holding cell?" "I was arrested last night, Mr. Mayor," Stella said, her voice echoing in the dead, silent room. She didn't look at Henderson. Her dark, piercing eyes were locked directly onto Officer Mateo Briggs, pinning him to the floor like an insect under glass. "By Officer Briggs. Arrested?" The DOJ agent stepped forward, pulling out a notepad. "On what charges? Reckless driving, resisting arrest, and suspicion of narcotics possession," Stella recited, quoting Briggs from the night before. "Though I should note, no narcotics were found. The traffic stop was initiated without probable cause. My vehicle was illegally searched, and I was subjected to excessive force." "This is insane," Henderson roared, turning on Briggs. "Are you out of your mind, Briggs? Do you have any idea who this woman is?" Briggs was shaking now. The arrogant, swaggering bully from Route 9 had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified man realizing his career was over. I didn't know. She didn't say she was... "I didn't have to say who I was, Officer Briggs," Stella interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous low register. She closed the distance between them, stopping just 2 feet away from him. Despite being shorter than him, her presence completely dominated the space. "My identity doesn't dictate my constitutional rights. The badge on your chest is a contract with the public, not a license to terrorize them." Stella turned to Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant, my belongings." "Now." Yes, Captain." Miller practically sprinted to the plastic bin behind the desk and handed it to her. Stella reached in, pulled out her phone, and then pulled out a small, heavy leather case. She flipped it open. Inside sat a gleaming gold shield, the captain's badge, but right next to it, pinned to the leather, was the gold trident of the United States Navy SEALs. Briggs stared at the trident, his breath hitching. The rumors were true. The state hadn't just sent a desk jockey. They had sent a Tier 1 operator to clean out his precinct. Stella snapped the case shut and placed it in her pocket. She looked around the room, making eye contact with every single officer present. "Last night, Officer Briggs told me I was under arrest," Stella said, her voice echoing with absolute authority. She looked back at Briggs, a cold, hard smile touching the corners of her mouth. "But as of 800 hours this morning, Officer Briggs, I am your new commander, and your first official order under my command is to hand over your badge and your service weapon. You're fired." The words hung in the stale air of the bullpen, heavy and absolute. "You're fired!" For 3 agonizing seconds nobody moved. The only sound in the 42nd precinct was the harsh buzzing of the fluorescent overhead lights. Officer Mateo Briggs stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the color entirely drained from his thick neck and face. The reality of the situation was crashing into him like a freight train, dismantling his 15 years of unchecked authority in a matter of syllables. "You can't do that," Briggs stammered, his voice lacking its previous venom. He looked toward Sergeant Miller, then to Mayor David Henderson. "Mayor, you gonna let her come in here and do this? Without union representation? Without a hearing?" Mayor Henderson adjusted his tie, his expression colder than the Washington winter outside. "Captain Jenkins has the full, unmitigated backing of my office, the City Council, and the Governor. Your union representative was notified of your impending termination at 700 hours this morning, pending the DOJ's review of your recent use of force reports. I believe your stunt last night just expedited the timeline." DOJ agent William Reynolds, a sharp-featured man with eyes like polished obsidian, stepped forward. He pulled a silver digital recorder from his breast pocket. "Officer Briggs, pursuant to Title 18 U.S.C., Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law, you are now the subject of an active federal civil rights investigation. I strongly suggest you comply with your commanding officer's orders." Briggs looked around the room. His eyes darted to Officer Greg Higgins, seeking an ally, but Higgins immediately averted his gaze, staring intently at the floorboards. The infamous blue wall of silence was crumbling before it could even be erected. "The badge and the weapon, Briggs," Stella repeated. Her tone wasn't loud, but it possessed a lethal stillness. In her mind, she was operating on the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Briggs was in the orient phase, utterly paralyzed by the shock of the ambush. Slowly, his hands trembling violently, Briggs reached for his duty belt. He unholstered his Glock 17, his fingers slick with nervous sweat. For a terrifying fraction of a second, the muzzle dipped, sweeping across the floor. Stella's posture didn't change, but her muscles coiled. She had disarmed insurgents armed with AK-47s in the Korengol Valley. A panicking, out-of-shape patrolman with a 9mm was barely a blip on her threat radar. Briggs popped the magazine out, cleared the chamber, and placed the firearm on the booking desk. Next came his radio, his taser, and finally, he unpinned the silver star from his chest. The metal clattered loudly against the wood. "Empty your locker and vacate the premises," Stella commanded. "Agent Reynolds will escort you to your vehicle. If you step foot on city property again, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." As Briggs was marched out of the building in absolute humiliation, the remaining officers stood in a state of shell shock. Stella didn't give them time to recover. She turned to the room, her eyes sweeping over the remaining shift personnel. "Sergeant Miller," Stella said, her voice snapping him to attention. "Yes, Captain." "I want the body camera footage of every officer in this precinct for the last 90 days, downloaded onto encrypted external drives by noon," she ordered. "I want a complete inventory of the evidence locker, and I want the personnel file of every officer standing in this room on my desk in 10 minutes. "Captain, the evidence locker audit alone will take weeks," Miller started. "Then I suggest you skip your coffee break, Sergeant," Stella cut him off cleanly. "I am not here to play politics. I am here to excise a cancer. If any of you feel that adhering to the United States Constitution is too heavy a burden for you to bear, the door is right behind you. Leave your badge on the desk. But if you choose to stay, you will operate with integrity, discipline, and absolute accountability. Dismissed." The officers scattered like roaches in the light. Stella grabbed her plastic bin of belongings and walked down the hallway toward the captain's office. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The room smelled of cigar smoke and stale cologne, the lingering scent of her predecessor, a man who had conveniently opted for early retirement when the DOJ started sniffing around. She set her box on the desk, booted up the archaic desktop computer, and looked out the window at the grey, rain-slicked streets of Oakhaven. The tactical victory of firing Briggs was satisfying, but Stella knew it was only the opening skirmish. Briggs was a symptom, The real disease ran much deeper in the veins of the city, and they were about to fight back. 3 days into Stella's command, the pushback began. It didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or shouting matches in the hallway. It arrived in the form of silence. It started on Friday morning. Of the 42 sworn patrol officers scheduled for the day shift, 18 called in sick. By the evening shift, another 12 suddenly developed debilitating migraines or gastrointestinal issues. It was a coordinated, illegal labor action known colloquially as the Blue Flu. The corrupt elements of the Oakhaven Police Department were attempting to paralyze the city, hoping the resulting spike in crime would force the mayor to buckle and remove Stella from her post. Stella sat at her desk, reviewing the catastrophic dispatch logs. Response times for Priority 1 calls, domestic violence, armed robberies, assaults had skyrocketed from 7 minutes to an unacceptable 45 minutes. A sharp knock broke her concentration. The door swung open to reveal Detective Paul Carter. Carter was a 20-year veteran of the force. He wore expensive, tailored suits that vastly exceeded a detective's municipal salary, and he wore a permanent, smug smile that suggested he knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. He was the unspoken leader of the precinct's old guard, and Stella had already flagged his file for deep review due to his astonishingly high rate of dismissed drug cases. "Captain Jenkins," Carter said, as he pushed open her office door without bothering to knock or wait for permission. He walked in as though the room belonged to him, carrying a thick stack of unfiled reports under one arm. With a casual flick of his wrist, he dropped them onto her desk. The folders landed with a heavy thud, papers shifting in every direction. "We have a bit of a situation out there," he said, wearing the smug half-smile that always seemed to accompany trouble. "The boys are dropping like flies, calling in sick, passing out on shift, complaining they can't keep food down. Something going around, I suppose." Stella Jenkins slowly leaned back in her leather chair, folding her hands across her lap. She studied him for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. Not once did she gesture toward the empty chair across from her desk. "Is that right, Detective?" she asked evenly, her calm tone making the question sound far more dangerous than an accusation. "It's a tough job," Carter sighed in mock sympathy, leaning his knuckles on her desk. "Stress compromises the immune system, and, well, morale is at rock bottom. Firing Tommy Briggs without due process. It spooked the herd. Cops need to know their commanding officer has their back when they're out on the streets. Right now, they feel like there's a target on theirs." Carter leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oakhaven is a complicated ecosystem, Captain. It has its own rhythm. You try to force a new beat, the whole machine breaks down. Maybe if you reinstated Briggs, put out a memo softening these new accountability protocols, a miraculous recovery might sweep through the ranks." It was extortion. Plain and simple. Stella looked at Carter. She didn't see a formidable adversary. She saw a complacent, arrogant man who had spent 2 decades bullying a small pond. He had no idea what it meant to face real opposition. He thought she was a politician in a uniform. He didn't realize she was a hunter. "Let me clarify something for you, Detective Carter," Stella said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I do not negotiate with terrorists, and currently, the officers orchestrating this sick-out are holding the safety of the citizens of Oakhaven hostage to protect a bigot. That makes them a threat to my city." Carter's smug smile faltered slightly. "Terrorists? That's big talk for a captain with no patrolmen to dispatch. You can't police a city by yourself." "I don't intend to," Stella replied. She picked up a remote from her desk and clicked it, turning on the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying a live feed of the precinct's back parking lot. Carter turned to look, his brow furrowing in confusion. Pulling into the lot were 6 unmarked, matte black Chevy Suburbans, followed by a mobile command center. Men and women in tactical gear began pouring out of the vehicles. They weren't local cops. They were wearing dark green tactical uniforms, heavily armed, moving with lethal, synchronized precision. On the back of their tactical vests were the bright yellow letters, State Police, Tactical Response Unit. "What the hell is that?" Carter demanded, pointing at the screen. "That, Detective Carter, is a contingency plan," Stella stated smoothly. "Anticipating this exact temper tantrum from your herd, I contacted Governor Harrison directly. He signed an emergency declaration at 400 hours this morning. The state police, backed by federal task force officers, are taking over all patrol duties in Oak Haven until further notice." Carter was visibly sweating now, his tailored suit suddenly feeling very restrictive. You brought the state in? You're turning over our jurisdiction?" "No, I am maintaining law and order," Stella corrected him, standing up. She walked around the desk, invading Carter's personal space, forcing him to take a step back. "And while the state police are handling the 911 calls, Agent Reynolds and the DOJ are going to spend the weekend executing federal search warrants on the financial records of every officer who called in sick today." Carter's eyes widened in genuine panic. "You can't do that. That's a violation of privacy. If they're too sick to work, they should be resting at home," Stella said, a cold glint in her eye. "But we found it quite interesting that your name is attached to nearly every single narcotic seizure that Briggs made over the last 5 years. Seizures where the cash recovered magically dwindled before it hit the evidence locker. Warrants are already being drafted, Paul." Stella stepped back, her posture rigid, commanding the room with the unquestionable authority of a Navy SEAL who had just successfully executed a flanking maneuver. "The blue flu is cured, Detective," Stella said coldly. "Now get out of my office. You have a lot of paperwork to catch up on before the feds toss your desk." By Monday morning, the blue flu had completely collapsed under the crushing weight of federal scrutiny. The sight of state police tactical units patrolling the streets of Oak Haven had sent a shockwave of panic through the corrupt ranks of the 42nd Precinct. Officers who had claimed they were too sick to walk to their patrol cars were suddenly showing up for their shifts, offering pathetic, stammering apologies to Sergeant Miller. But Captain Stella Jenkins was not interested in apologies. She was interested in the paper trail. While the state police maintained order on the streets, Stella transformed the precinct's basement conference room into a heavily guarded command center. The windows were blacked out, and only personnel vetted directly by DOJ agent William Reynolds were allowed past the biometric lock Stella had installed on the door. Inside, the walls were covered in corkboards connected by red string, tracking a sprawling web of dirty money, dismissed court cases, and illegal narcotics distribution. Agent Reynolds stood over a table covered in bank statements, his sleeves rolled up, rubbing his tired eyes. "You were right, Captain. The financial discrepancies are staggering, but they're also incredibly sloppy. Detective Paul Carter and Officer Mateo Briggs weren't just stealing from the evidence locker. They were running a fully operational protection racket." Stella leaned over the table, tracing a line of deposits on a highlighted ledger. "Show me the structure." "Briggs was the street-level enforcer," Reynolds explained, tapping a photograph of the disgraced officer. "All those proactive traffic stops he was so famous for? The ones where he illegally searched vehicles and harassed minorities? It wasn't just bigotry, though he has plenty of that. It was territorial control." Stella's eyes narrowed. "He was acting as a border patrol for a local cartel." "Exactly," Reynolds nodded. "Briggs targeted anyone who looked like they didn't belong in Oak Haven, specifically out-of-towners and marginalized individuals, under the guise of racist profiling. But his real objective was to ensure no rival drug suppliers were moving product into the county. He was keeping the market completely monopolized for a local methamphetamine syndicate. "And Carter?" Stella asked, her voice cold. "Carter was the fixer," Reynolds said. "If a lower-level dealer in their protected syndicate accidentally got arrested by a clean cop, Carter would take over the case file. He'd intentionally mishandle the evidence, fail to secure chain of custody, or refuse to appear at the preliminary hearing. The district attorney would have no choice but to drop the charges. In exchange, Carter and Briggs were receiving massive cash kickbacks from the head of the syndicate." "Who is at the top of this food chain?" Stella demanded. Before Reynolds could answer, a frantic, rhythmic knocking echoed against the heavy door of the command center. Stella checked the security camera feed on her tablet. It was Officer Greg Higgins. The young patrolman looked utterly terrified, drenched in sweat, clutching a heavy leather-bound notebook to his chest. Stella unlocked the door and pulled Higgins inside, securing the deadbolt behind him. "Higgins," Stella said firmly, gripping his trembling shoulder. "Breathe. What is going on?" "They know," Higgins gasped, his eyes darting frantically around the windowless room. "Carter knows the feds are auditing his offshore accounts. He's panicking. He called a meeting tonight with the supplier." "Who is the supplier, Greg?" Reynolds pressed, stepping forward. Higgins swallowed hard, placing the leather notebook on the table. "Arthur Penhaligon. They call him Red. He runs the entire manufacturing operation out of the old cannery at the south end of the shipping docks. Briggs and Carter have been on his payroll for 6 years. I found Carter's personal ledger. I swear to God, Captain Jenkins, I never took a dime from them. But I knew about it, and I was too scared to say anything. Briggs told me if I ever talked, he'd make sure my wife and kids had a fatal car accident on Route 9. Stella looked at the young officer. He was complicit through silence, a victim of the systemic rot that had consumed the precinct. But tonight, he had chosen to step into the light. "You did the right thing bringing this to me, Higgins," Stella said, her tone softening just enough to steady his nerves. "But now, I need you to disappear. Agent Reynolds is going to place you and your family in protective custody immediately." As Reynolds escorted Higgins out a secure back exit, Stella opened the leather ledger. It was a gold mine. Carter had meticulously recorded every bribe, every dropped case, and every shipment of narcotics that came through the Oakhaven docks. But one entry, dated for that exact evening, caught her eye. 2300 hours. South Cannery. Final liquidation. 2.5 million. Carter wasn't just meeting with Arthur Penhaligon. He was cashing out. The walls were closing in, and the dirty detective was preparing to take his bribe money, liquidate the syndicate's current inventory, and flee the country. Stella checked her tactical watch. It was 20-30 hours. She had less than 3 hours to dismantle a heavily armed drug syndicate and arrest a rogue detective. She picked up the encrypted radio on her desk. "State Police Tactical Leader, this is Captain Jenkins. Spin up the assault teams. We have a confirmed target location at the South Docks. Full kinetic entry. Briefing in 10 minutes. Stella unzipped her duffel bag, the same one Briggs had illegally searched just a few nights prior. She pulled out a heavy Kevlar tactical vest, a matte black drop-leg holster, and a customized Sig Sauer P226. As she locked a loaded magazine into the weapon, the civilian captain vanished entirely. The Navy SEAL had entered the chat. The rain returned to Oakhaven, a torrential downpour that provided the perfect auditory cover for the convoy of unmarked tactical vehicles rolling completely dark toward the abandoned South Cannery. Stella rode in the lead Suburban, her face painted in the eerie green glow of the tactical mapping screen. Beside her sat Commander Hayes of the State Police Tactical Unit, a seasoned veteran who had quickly realized that the new captain was vastly more qualified in urban warfare than anyone in the state. "Thermal imaging shows 6 hostiles on the ground floor, heavily armed," Hayes whispered, pointing at the glowing orange heat signatures on the drone feed, 3 more on the catwalks, and 2 signatures in the main office. That's likely our Detective Carter and Arthur Penhaligon. We hit them from 3 points of entry simultaneously, Stella instructed, her voice a calm, modulated whisper. Alpha Team breaches the loading dock doors. Bravo Team takes the roof access and clears the catwalks. I will lead Charlie Team through the subterranean drainage pipe that empties into the main floor. We cut off their escape routes. Non-lethal force is authorized unless you are fired upon. But make no mistake, gentlemen, these men are backed into a corner, and they will shoot to kill. At exactly 23 hours, the operation commenced. Stella waded waist-deep through the freezing, rancid water of the drainage pipe, her suppressed rifle held high. Her breathing was slow, controlled, immune to the freezing temperatures. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. She reached the heavy iron grate that led up to the cannery floor. With a swift, practiced motion, she and 2 tactical officers used bolt cutters to snap the rusted padlocks. Stella silently lifted the grate and rolled onto the concrete floor of the warehouse, melting into the shadows behind a stack of wooden crates. Through the darkness, she could hear the frantic voices coming from the elevated glass-walled office. "I told you she was a problem!" Detective Paul Carter was shouting, furiously stuffing stacks of $100 bills into a large duffel bag. "Briggs was an idiot to pull her over. She's tearing the department apart. I need the rest of the cash, Red. Now!" Arthur Penhaligon, a towering man with a scarred face, coldly racked the slide of an assault rifle. "You aren't going anywhere, Paul. You swore you had this precinct under control. Now the state police are in my backyard. You're a liability." Before Penhaligon could raise the weapon at Carter, a deafening explosion shattered the night. Alpha Team blew the massive steel doors off the loading docks with shaped C4 charges. Simultaneously, Bravo Team shattered the skylights, dropping flashbang grenades onto the catwalks. Blinding white light and concussive thunder ripped through the warehouse. "State Police, drop your weapons!" Gunfire erupted instantly as Penhaligon's guards blindly fired into the smoke. But they were street thugs fighting against highly trained tactical operators. Within 45 seconds, the ground floor hostiles were disarmed, zip-tied, and pinned to the concrete. Up in the office, chaos reigned. Penhaligon, realizing his empire was collapsing, turned his rifle toward the loading dock and opened fire. Stella didn't hesitate. She sprinted from her cover, bounding up the rusted metal staircase leading to the office with terrifying speed. Penhaligon turned, hearing the heavy boots on the metal grate, but Stella was already inside his perimeter. She didn't use her firearm. She moved fluidly, grabbing the hot barrel of his rifle and pushing it violently upward as it discharged into the ceiling. In the same motion, she drove her elbow brutally into Penhaligon's solar plexus, stealing the breath from his lungs. As he doubled over, she swept his legs, sending the massive crime boss crashing through the glass wall of the office and onto the floor below, where Alpha Team immediately secured him. Stella turned back toward the office interior. Detective Paul Carter was scrambling desperately toward the back exit, clutching the duffel bag of cash. He pulled his service weapon, spinning around blindly in panic. "Drop the weapon, Carter." Stella's voice sliced through the ringing silence of the room. Carter froze. The muzzle of his gun was trembling wildly, pointed vaguely in Stella's direction. Stella stood perfectly still, her Sig Sauer aimed dead center at Carter's chest. Her finger hovered millimeters from the trigger. You ruined everything," Carter sobbed, the arrogant, tailored detective reduced to a pathetic, terrified criminal. "I had this town in the palm of my hand." "You poisoned this town," Stella corrected coldly. "You wore a badge while acting as a parasite. Now, you have exactly 3 seconds to drop that firearm before I end this permanently. 1. Carter's eyes darted toward the exit. 2. The terrifying, absolute certainty in Stella's eyes broke him. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she would kill him before his brain could even register the command to pull his own trigger. Carter dropped the gun. It clattered against the floorboards. He fell to his knees, covering his face, as state police operators swarmed the office, wrestling his arms behind his back and slapping heavy steel cuffs on his wrists. Stella lowered her weapon and holstered it. She looked down at the duffel bag of dirty money spilling onto the floor, then out at the warehouse, now secured and swarming with law enforcement. It was over. 6 months later, Oak Haven was a different city. The federal indictments had swept through the county like a cleansing fire. Mateo Briggs was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for civil rights violations and racketeering. Paul Carter took a plea deal, turning state's evidence against Arthur Penhaligon, but still received 20 years behind bars. The 42nd Precinct had been entirely rebuilt. The corrupt old guard was purged, replaced by a diverse, highly trained, and fiercely accountable new generation of officers. Community trust, once completely shattered, was slowly but surely being restored through transparency and genuine public service. On a bright, sunny Tuesday morning, Captain Stella Jenkins stood in the exact spot on Route 9 where Briggs had pulled her over in the rain. She wasn't in a faded hoodie anymore. She was in her crisp, immaculately tailored dress uniform, the gold captain's shield gleaming on her chest, her Navy SEAL trident pinned proudly beneath it. She watched a local Oak Haven patrol cruiser drive by. The officer inside, a rookie she had personally hired, gave her a crisp salute. Stella returned the nod. She had spent her life fighting enemies overseas, operating in the darkest corners of the world to protect the nation. But as she looked out over the quiet, safe town of Oak Haven, she realized that sometimes the most important battles were fought right here at home. Sometimes the bravest thing a warrior could do was stand in the light and refuse to let the darkness win. Justice isn't always swift, and it rarely comes easily. When power is abused by those sworn to protect, it takes unbreakable courage to dismantle the corruption from the inside out. Captain Stella Jenkins proved that true leadership isn't about demanding authority. It's about accountability, resilience, and defending the vulnerable. From surviving a racist illegal traffic stop to commanding a precinct and taking down a dangerous criminal syndicate, her story is a testament to the fact that integrity will always outmaneuver arrogance. The badge is a sacred trust, and those who weaponize it will inevitably face their reckoning. If this story of justice and unbreakable courage resonated with you, please hit that like button to help us share it with others. Drop a comment below, letting us know what you thought of Captain Jenkins' incredible takedown of the corrupt precinct. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more thrilling, real-life inspired stories of heroes fighting back. Share this video with a friend and stay safe out there.